Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. Before I start my speech, I just want to understand the audience I'm speaking to. So can I see a show of our hands? I work in the carbon markets, in the value chain of carbon markets. Can I see your hands? Wow. Okay, great. I'm here to learn about the challenges and opportunities around carbon markets. Can I see a show of hands? Great. So before I start, Erin has alluded to this interlinked crisis we're facing today, the climate and the nature crisis. According to the UN reports, they estimate about $3.3 trillion to $4.5 trillion per year needs to be mobilized to address the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals for us to reach that. And we only have 5 years left. And if you look at this in the scheme of carbon markets, what's the size of voluntary carbon market today? It's slightly less than $2 billion. So it's really a drop in a bucket in terms of the total finance that's needed to drive the sustainable development impact on the ground to reach what the science tells us to reach. Then why is this mechanism so trendy? So sort of a hot potato these days, exciting and also challenging. And I want to share with you a little bit of the learnings and observations I've had in the last 2 years with Gold Standard, who's been around for 20 plus years in trying to drive integrity in this mechanism. So in terms of the efforts we need, I often get pulled into debates around, do we need to mitigate first and adapt later? Do we need to reduce first and remove later? Do we need to focus on energy and technology solutions and think about nature-based solutions later? And I really get frustrated in these debates because as the event is called Change Now, we don't have time to do one thing or the other or one thing before the other. We need to do both. And we need to act fast. So how do we deliver these different tools in a massive toolbox? And carbon markets is one of the tools that can address all of these problems in one ecosystem. That's why I still believe, even if it's small, it's hugely catalytic in driving change on the ground. So the two learnings I want to share with you before we hear from the esteemed panelists later on details of it. One is we need to understand the integrity of the system. So the carbon markets, often we look at supply side. So there are many actors involved in carbon markets. So you need to look at this from a value chain perspective. So there's the local communities, NGOs, the indigenous people, where the projects are taking place. And there's the project developers, often the local NGO or not, but the project developers who are designing these projects and interventions and trying to deliver impact on the ground. There's a really important role for a project developer to play in ensuring integrity of the entire system, is to ensure that they're not doing harm in the project site for the community that they're serving, and that they make sure they hear from the communities through local stakeholder consultations and follow the rules of the game. And then you have the standard bodies like Gold Standard and others. And recently we're seeing a lot of global level standard setting initiatives like ICVCM. We have the Paris Agreement Article 6, where the different markets are trying to benchmark. So the rule setters need to make sure that the rules evolve, aligned with science, because what was true 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, is no longer valid. So how do standard setters and assurance systems ensure that we set rules in line with evolving science? And how can we make this an easier process? I often get comments from stakeholders saying, Jesus, Maggie, your processes are so complex, so expensive. For large project developers in global north, that may not be a huge problem because they have resources to mobilize. But what about local NGOs that are doing a small project in a small village? So how can you make it relevant to reduce those barriers? So the standard setters have a huge role to play, and also to digitize the workflow so that we can reduce the barrier for entries to many of these communities who are trying to access carbon finance. And we also have in that whole value chain the intermediaries, consultants, the advisors, who's trying to connect the dots between the complexity of the supply, the projects, and the buyers, and the demand. So these intermediaries also have a role to play in ensuring integrity so that the buyers understand what they're buying and what they're using it for. And the consultants also have a strong role to play in ensuring that they bridge the gap, any gap there may be between the different stakeholder groups. And finally, buyers, corporates, governments, or individuals. The buyers have a real important role to play in ensuring the integrity of the system. The buyers need to reduce within and try to finance beyond. What that means, as individuals like you and me, we need to reduce in our daily lives before thinking about offsetting or using carbon markets to offset my emission reduction. And the same logic goes to the corporates. Obviously, it's much more complex. And corporates need to get on that journey to reduce within their value chains and contribute beyond. And in all of this, for the ecosystem to work with so-called high integrity, the individuals like you and me, the media, have a huge role to play because we love very attractive headlines, very extreme headlines, and we read the headlines only. And when we go buy, purchase things, we only look at the label and we don't think too much about what we're buying, how our action is impacting the farming communities or the fishing communities. So we have a role to play in, one, being educated. We need to understand what these mean. These projects are complex, use hugely technical jargons, but we do need to understand what we're investing in. And second, we need to recognize the progress, because you can't possibly expect the corporates to get to net zero overnight. And these are not charities. So how do we recognize and acknowledge the progress, the positive progress corporates are making, and help them move in that journey instead of focusing on a very narrow vision, criticism? The second learning I want to share with you is about the stories behind these carbon credits, because many of you who work in this area, if you're a project developer, you'll understand. Most times, the projects don't start because of carbon credits, and the communities don't change their behaviors because of carbon credits. Carbon finance is put in as a catalytic finance to bring in more private sector investment. So behind these individual carbon credits, these for many tradable commodities, there's stories of people. I'm going to give you two examples. One is cook stove. In the world today, 2.3 billion people still cook in open fire. And many of you sitting here, it's probably not relevant to us, but 2.3 billion people still cook in open fire. And yet domestic cooking is not really considered as productive economy. So less prone to regulation, less subject to subsidy discussions, and therefore hard to reach. The carbon markets have been funding clean cooking initiatives around the globe for the last 20 years. And what this created is reduced in air pollution in the households, reduce health casualties, health issues in families, reducing resources put to buy charcoal and wood to cook, and bringing children to school, girls to school, women to economic activities to improve livelihoods because they don't have to spend time fetching wood. So if you ask, is this really about one carbon credit, 1 ton of reduction, or is it about change that's happening in someone's family, someone's village, someone's community? The second example is mangroves, because we often talk about reduction versus removal. Mangrove restoration to capture carbon removal has so many benefits in coastal communities. It increases recreation activities, which increases green jobs. It often protects the villages, the coastal villages from storms. And it revives the marine ecosystem around those restored mangroves. So is this a pure carbon reduction removal project? No, it's also adaptation. So we tend to get played into this division of ideas that there's mitigation and there's adaptation, but many of these community-based projects have been delivering both impact for the last 2 decades and not getting recognized for it. So when we talk about challenges around carbon credits, I want all of us to have those 2 aspects in mind, that it's an economic mechanism that exists today, that's quite transparent, that can link the supply and demand. So there's an economic story to it. And secondly, and more importantly, there's the societal story to it, that every carbon credit, although they represent a ton of CO2, is not created equal. So I wish you can take those away in listening to the esteemed panel members going forward. Thank you very much.